My name is Isabella, 26 years old, and until that freezing night, I was treated as the ultimate family charity case. My husband Derek, a 30-year-old senior investment director at a Manhattan firm, loved reminding everyone that he had rescued me from the orphanage. What he did not know was that the helpless orphan he just abandoned on the highway was quietly sitting on a massive fortune and the very means to his absolute destruction. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to completely destroy a toxic person who underestimated your worth. Get out and take that sniveling burden with you. My husband shoved me and our sick infant out of the passenger seat and into the freezing rain on the shoulder of the interstate. His tires screeched as his car sped away, disappearing into the torrential New York downpour. I stood shivering in the dark, clutching my baby tightly against my chest, stranded and left for dead by the man who had vowed to protect us. A sleek black BMW suddenly pulled up through the curtain of rain. A tall man stepped out, holding an umbrella. Before I could even react, he looked at me, his voice steady but carrying a decade of weight. "I have been looking for you for 10 years." The freezing rain soaked through my thin jacket as cars whipped past us on the highway. Derek had pulled over just miles from our suburban home after an argument about my lack of pedigree. "You are nothing but an uneducated burden," he yelled, rain lashing against his tailored suit as he leaned out the driver window. "You have no college degree and no family to run back to. Every single thing you own, even the cheap shirt on your back, is paid for by me. I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning. I am moving my new fiancé into the house, and there is nothing a useless street rat can do about it." I did not beg. I did not cry. I simply reached into the car, grabbed his wrist, and coldly unclasped the heavy silver watch from his arm. Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes as I pulled it away. "Take the stupid fake knockoff," he sneered. "You always buy me cheap trash anyway." He had no idea that the Patek Philippe watch was completely authentic. It cost $80,000 paid for in cash from my hidden personal accounts. For 3 years, I let him believe it was a cheap replica to protect my secret. I looked him dead in the eyes and slipped the watch into my pocket. "You do not deserve this," I told him, my voice cutting through the roar of the storm. Derek laughed maliciously, rolled up his window, and sped off into the night, leaving his wife and sick child on the side of a dangerous highway. I shielded my son from the biting wind, my mind shifting immediately from playing the submissive housewife to calculating my next tactical move. My survival instincts, honed from years in the foster system, kicked in. Headlights pierced the darkness as a dark BMW smoothly pulled onto the shoulder right in front of me. The door opened and Elias stepped out into the storm. He was 35 years old, a senior corporate lawyer with a sharp gaze and an immaculate suit. He held a large umbrella over my head, shielding my baby and me from the freezing downpour. "Isabella," he said, pulling a waterproof tablet from his briefcase. I finally decoded the final legal barrier. I wiped the rain from my eyes and looked at the glowing screen. It displayed a secured offshore trust account holding exactly $500 million. The funds were fully unthawed and legally registered in my name. Elias had been a young legal intern 10 years ago when he witnessed my adoptive family and Derek bribe an orphanage director to hide the true will of my biological father, an eccentric tech billionaire. Elias spent the last decade secretly deciphering the legal locks they placed on my rightful inheritance. He became my most trusted ally, working entirely in the shadows. "There is more," Elias said, swiping to the next screen on the tablet. Derek just finalized a massive loan for his investment firm. He was desperate for capital to cover up his reckless spending. He collateralized his entire corporate portfolio to a private shell corporation just an hour ago to secure the funds. I stared at the corporate documents displayed on the screen, a slow smile forming on my face. The shell corporation Derek used for his desperate loan was Vanguard Holdings. Vanguard Holdings was an entity I legally owned and operated under my anonymous professional alias. Derek had just handed the keys to his entire financial empire directly to the wife he thought was a penniless idiot. Let him enjoy his delusion for one more night, I said, handing the tablet back to Elias. My husband thinks I am a vulnerable orphan with zero resources. He is about to learn exactly how dangerous a woman with nothing to lose can be. I gently wiped the cold rain from my child's pale cheeks. His small body was shivering and his forehead felt hot. The maternal rage burning inside me eclipsed any remaining trace of the quiet wife I had pretended to be. I pulled out a secure, untraceable burner phone from my coat pocket. I opened an encrypted messaging application and typed a message to Jamal. Jamal was a brilliant African-American auditor who happened to be married to Derek's sister. Derek and his family constantly degraded Jamal, treating him like a second-class citizen because of his racial background and working-class roots. But Jamal was a man of fierce integrity and my inside man. I quickly hit send now. Check routing number 409 immediately. The game begins. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room waiting area felt like a physical weight. My son was burning up against my chest, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. The freezing rain from the highway had pushed his temperature to a dangerous level. I rushed him directly to the hyper-exclusive Manhattan Pediatric Institute, a facility known for treating the heirs of billionaires. It was the only place I truly trusted with his young life. I sat in a stiff vinyl chair, clutching my sleeping baby closely to my chest, praying for help. The pristine silence shattered when the heavy double doors swung open. Derek marched in his tailored suit, immaculate, his face twisted into pure annoyance. Right behind him was his mother, Caroline. She moved with the rigid entitlement of a woman who believed her mere presence was a charity. I just held my son tighter and met their hostile glares with icy indifference. Caroline stopped a few feet away, wrinkling her nose. She pulled a disinfectant wipe from her handbag and meticulously wiped down the pristine hospital chair across from me before sitting. She smoothed her expensive skirt and looked at me with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "Sign it," she snapped, throwing a sleek silver pen and a thick legal document directly onto my lap. The heavy paper slid against my son's blanket. "Do not let your dirty orphanage blood ruin my grandson's pedigree. I will give you exactly $5,000 in cash to catch a bus back to whatever miserable slum you originally crawled out of." I glanced down at the paper. It was a full custody surrender form demanding I relinquish all parental rights immediately. Derek crossed his arms, smirking down at me. "You really thought you could bring him to a place like this?" "Isabella," he sneered, pointing at the gold hospital logo. "This is an elite private facility. You do not belong here. You have no money and you have no insurance. I called human resources the second I left you on the highway last night. I terminated your coverage and his. You are a homeless, unemployed nobody, and you cannot afford a single bandage here. Sign the papers or I will have hospital security throw you out for trespassing." I looked at the custody form, then up at the two people who thought they held my existence in their hands. I picked up the silver pen. Caroline leaned forward, a triumphant gleam in her eyes, expecting me to comply. Instead, I snapped the pen in half with a sharp crack and dropped the broken pieces onto the floor. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice dangerously calm. Caroline gasped, clutching her pearls. "You ungrateful little street rat," she hissed. Derek lunged forward, reaching violently for my arm. Before his hand could make contact, an authoritative voice echoed through the corridor. "Excuse me, but you need to step away from Mrs. Isabella immediately." Dr. Winters, the renowned head of pediatrics, was walking briskly toward us, flanked by two stern hospital security guards. Caroline immediately put on her best society smile. "Dr. Winters," she cooed. "Thank goodness you are here. My son Derek is a senior director, and we need this unstable woman removed from your premises. She cannot pay for these services." Dr. Winters completely ignored Caroline's desperate attempts to gain his attention. He walked straight past her extended hand and stopped respectfully in front of me. To the absolute shock of my husband and mother-in-law, the esteemed doctor offered a deep, polite bow. "Mrs. Isabella," he said warmly, his tone filled with deference. "The VIP penthouse suite has been fully prepped for your son. The entire floor is secured for your privacy, and the best specialists are waiting upstairs. And I must personally thank you for the generous endowment. Your $100,000 cash payment for the suite has cleared perfectly." Caroline's jaw dropped open, her fake smile vanishing instantly. Derek stumbled back a step, his face draining of color. $100,000? Derek stammered, looking wildly from me to the doctor. "That is impossible. She does not have a dime to her name." I stood up slowly and carefully cradling my sleeping baby. I turned my attention to the two hospital security guards. "Officers," I said, my tone sharp and commanding. "This man just admitted in front of witnesses to intentionally terminating his infant's health insurance overnight while the child was critically ill. Under New York state law, that constitutes a felony for child endangerment. I want him detained and a full police report filed against him immediately." The security guards instantly stepped toward Derek, moving to block his path. Derek's eyes widened in absolute panic as the guards flanked him. "You cannot do this!" he yelled, his voice cracking as he backed away. "Do you know who I am? You are a nobody, Isabella. A pathetic orphan, playing dress-up in a world you do not understand. I will call Veronica's father right now. He is the CEO of the biggest investment firm in the city. I will have him use every connection he has to blacklist you. You will never work in New York. I will make sure you starve on the streets." I simply smiled at his pathetic, desperate threats without saying a word. The thought of him running to Veronica's father for protection was almost too perfect. He had absolutely no idea that the very firm he was hiding behind was the one I legally controlled. Before Derek could scream another threat, the security guards grabbed his arms, pulling him forcefully toward the exit, while Caroline shrieked in horror. Amidst the chaos, my heavy coat pocket vibrated twice. I pulled out my burner phone, keeping my eyes fixed on Derek being dragged away. It was a secure, urgent text from Jamal. Derek just illegally embezzled $2 million from the client pension fund to buy a massive diamond ring for Veronica. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Manhattan Pediatric Institute offered no warmth. I sat in the plush chair of the VIP suite, watching the steady rise and fall of my son's chest. The fever that had threatened to consume him after our night in the freezing rain had finally broken. He was safe now. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one about to breach my door. The heavy mahogany doors of the suite swung open with a violent thud. Derek marched into the room flanked by three men in pristine, tailored suits. They were not doctors. They carried the distinct predatory air of high-priced corporate lawyers. The hospital chief administrator trailed nervously behind them, clutching a clipboard. Derek looked around the luxurious $100,000 room, and his face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice echoing off the pristine walls. "Get this deranged woman out of here right now," Derek ordered, turning to the hospital administrator. "She is completely delusional. I told you on the phone, she has absolutely no means to pay for any of this. I canceled her health insurance last night. She is a homeless, unemployed squatter occupying your most expensive medical suite." The lead lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his silk tie. "Mrs. Isabella," he began, his tone dripping with practiced condescension, "my client, Mr. Derek, has informed us of your unfortunate mental decline. You are trespassing in a private medical facility. We have the necessary paperwork to forcefully transfer you and your infant to a state-funded public ward, immediately. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather your belongings before security physically escorts you off the premises." I did not move. I kept my eyes fixed on my sleeping baby, softly stroking his small hand. Derek scoffed, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. "You see this?" he asked the lawyers, gesturing toward me with dramatic exasperation. "This is the thanks I get for my charity. I pulled her out of a filthy, state-run orphanage. I gave her clothes, food, a roof over her head. I saved her from a life in the gutter. And how does she repay my endless generosity? She breaks into an elite hospital, pretending to be a woman of status. She is nothing but a pathetic street rat clinging to a lifestyle she could never earn on her own." The hospital administrator shifted uncomfortably, gripping his clipboard tight. "I am truly sorry, Mom," he said, though his eyes held no actual sympathy. "But Mr. Derrick is a respected senior investment director, and our hospital policies are strictly enforced. We require immediate proof of liquid assets or comprehensive insurance to maintain residency in this wing. Since your husband has legally severed your financial ties, we have no choice but to call the authorities if you refuse to comply." Derek smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked so incredibly proud of himself. He truly believed he had stripped me of my dignity, cornered me, and left me with absolutely nothing. He thought he was the ultimate predator in the room. He was entirely wrong. The heavy doors swung open a second time. Elias stepped into the room, moving with a quiet, lethal grace. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that instantly made Derek's high-priced lawyers look like cheap interns. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and an aura of absolute authority. Elias walked directly to my side, placing a protective hand on the back of my chair before turning his piercing gaze upon the men in the room. "Who the hell are you?" Derek demanded, his smug expression faltering. Elias did not even acknowledge Derek's existence. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick bound document stamped with a bright red federal seal. He handed it directly to the hospital administrator. "My name is Elias, and I am the lead legal counsel for Mrs. Isabella," he stated, his voice calm and devastatingly clear. "And I strongly advise you to read page 4 of that financial forensics report before you threaten my client with removal again." The administrator adjusted his glasses and flipped open the heavy document. His eyes scanned the page, and the color rapidly drained from his face. "What is this?" the administrator stammered, looking up in sheer panic. Elias smiled a cold, shark-like grin. "That is an undeniable record of wire fraud. You see, Administrator, my client, Mrs. Isabella, fully funded this VIP suite with a legitimate cash wire transfer early this morning. However, the same cannot be said for Mr. Derrick." The hospital administrator swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he held the paper. Elias stepped forward, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "According to your own hospital billing records, Mr. Derrick attempted to reserve a luxury maternity suite in this very building exactly 1 week ago for a woman named Veronica." The room gasped. Derrick stumbled backward, his face turning a sickly gray. "You used a corporate black card to pay the $50,000 deposit?" Derrick Elias continued, his tone slicing through the room like a blade. "But my forensics team traced that specific card. It does not belong to your investment firm. It is directly tied to the client pension fund. You embezzled $50,000 from elderly retirees to buy a hospital suite for your 25-year-old mistress." The hospital lawyers immediately backed away from Derrick, treating him like a severe liability. Derrick gritted his teeth, his fists shaking with blind fury. "You are both lying," he spat venomously. "Nobody in this city will ever believe a worthless street rat and her hired suit. I am hosting my engagement gala tonight, and Veronica's father will crush you." Elias smirked, pulling a sleek silver iPad from his briefcase. He handed the illuminated screen to Derrick, revealing a live countdown. "We will see who believes what at 8 o'clock tonight," Elias whispered. The heavy hospital doors swung shut behind us, leaving Derrick to stew in his own unraveling web of lies. 8 hours later, I stepped out of Elias' BMW onto the rain-slicked pavement of Fifth Avenue. The storm had passed, leaving the Manhattan air crisp and electric. I looked up at the towering skyscraper where Derrick and Veronica were hosting their opulent engagement and promotion gala. For years, I had played the quiet, grateful orphan who faded into the background of Derrick's ambition. Tonight, I was stepping into the light. Elias offered his arm, and I took it, feeling the weight of the silk custom bespoke gown I had purchased sweeping against the marble floors of the lobby. It was a deep midnight blue, structured and unapologetic, a far cry from the modest clearance rack dresses Derrick always forced me to wear, so I would not outshine him. As the gold elevator doors opened to the penthouse, the sheer excess of the event assaulted my senses. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over New York's financial elite. Waiters carried silver trays of caviar and champagne. And right in the center of it all stood Derek and Veronica, soaking up the adoration of the room. The moment Elias and I crossed the threshold, the ambient chatter dipped into a collective hush. Heads turned. I could hear the whispers rippling through the crowd, spreading like a localized virus. "That is the charity case, wife. Right," one woman murmured behind a feathered fan. "I heard Derek rescued her from a group home and she went completely crazy." "Why is she here?" Another man chuckled, tapping his champagne flute. "She probably came to beg for alimony. Look at that dress, she must have rented it to keep up appearances." I kept my chin high, letting their toxic assumptions bounce right off my armor. Veronica noticed me immediately. Her fake smile vanished, replaced by a sharp glare of territorial panic. She was wearing a blindingly ostentatious diamond necklace that sparkled aggressively under the chandelier lights. She leaned over and whispered frantically to a group of her wealthy socialite friends. Three of them immediately detached from the pack and glided toward me, holding full glasses of dark red wine. Their eyes were locked directly on my pristine midnight blue gown. They moved with the synchronized predatory grace of mean girls who had never been told no in their entire lives. Elias tensed beside me, but I gave his arm a gentle squeeze, signaling him to stand down. I had dealt with women like this my whole life, and I knew exactly how they operated. The leader of the group, a tall blonde in a sequined dress, feigned a sudden stumble. She lunged forward, thrusting her wine glass aggressively toward my chest, aiming perfectly for the center of my silk bodice. "Oh my goodness, I am so clumsy," she shrieked preemptively. Before the dark crimson liquid could even leave the rim of her glass, my hand shot out. My reflexes were lightning fast. I caught her wrist in an iron grip, stopping the glass dead in its tracks less than an inch from my dress. Not a single drop spilled. The blonde gasped, her eyes widening in genuine shock as she tried to yank her arm away, but I held it firmly in place. I looked down at the dark liquid swirling in the crystal glass and inhaled the aroma. A Chateau Margaux, 1998. I said, my voice projecting clearly over the sudden silence of the room. "A bold choice to waste on a rented dress assumption, do you not agree?" I released her wrist and she stumbled backward, spilling the wine all over her own sequined shoes. Veronica furiously pushed her way through the crowd to confront me, her face flushed with rage. "How dare you show your face here?" Veronica snarled, gesturing wildly to the security guards stationed by the elevators. "You are an unhinged stalker. Derek warned me you would try to ruin our night. Get out before I have you arrested." I did not retreat. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the distance between us. My eyes locked onto the massive diamond resting against her collarbone. "That is a truly fascinating piece of jewelry, Veronica," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous authority. "Custom made, Derek tells everyone. Did he also tell you it is a blood diamond?" The entire room went completely dead silent. Veronica scoffed loudly, but her hand instinctively flew up to cover the stone. "You are insane," she stammered, looking around at the guests. "This is a flawless, conflict-free diamond." I smiled, letting the cold reality of my words sink into the room. "Actually, it is a stolen conflict stone from the Sierra Leone registry," I announced, ensuring every investor and executive in the room could hear me clearly. "It was flagged by Interpol 3 weeks ago under the serial tracking number 472 Alpha. The stone was smuggled through a Cayman Islands shell company before Derek purchased it with embezzled pension funds. I know this because my data tracking algorithms traced the exact wire transfer from his corporate account to the black market broker." Veronica stood frozen, her face burning bright red with profound humiliation. Her wealthy friends took a collective step away from her, treating her like a radioactive pariah. Furious and desperate, she signaled the heavy-set security guards standing near the elevator bank. "Grab her and throw her out onto the street," Veronica screamed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. But before the security guards could even take a single step forward to touch me, a sudden explosive commotion erupted from the other side of the room near the marble bar. The guests gasped and spun around. Derek was publicly screaming at Jamal, his brother-in-law. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as the shouting from the mahogany bar intensified. I turned away from a hyperventilating Veronica and moved toward the commotion, my heels completely silent on the thick Persian rugs. Derek stood near the edge of the bar, his face flushed and ugly mottled crimson, jabbing his finger directly into Jamal's chest. Jamal stood frozen behind the bar counter. He was wearing a crisp white server uniform, a humiliating demotion for a brilliant financial auditor. He held a heavy bottle of vintage Merlot in his hands, his knuckles white from the strain of gripping it so tightly. He was desperately trying to maintain his composure under the withering glare of the party guests who had stopped their conversations to watch him. Derek snatched a crystal tumbler from the bar and slammed it down in front of Jamal. "Pour the wine, you incompetent idiot!" Derek barked, his voice echoing over the hushed whispers of the wealthy guests. "You cannot even do a simple manual labor job, right? You are just a bottom-feeder auditor living off my sister Diana. You bring absolutely nothing to the table. You are lucky I even let you step foot in this penthouse to earn a few pathetic scraps for your mother's hospital bills. Now pour my drink and learn your place." Jamal stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his left cheek. I knew exactly why he was enduring this vicious public abuse. His mother was battling aggressive leukemia, and Derek had gleefully leveraged his corporate connections to dangle a meager bonus in front of Jamal, forcing him to act as a glorified bartender in front of New York's elite just to afford her chemotherapy bills. It was a disgusting display of power, designed entirely to break a good man's spirit. Off to the side, Caroline stood with a group of older socialites, casually swirling her champagne. She did not look horrified by her son's behavior. She looked deeply entertained. She leaned in toward the woman dripping in Chanel pearls and laughed softly. "We are simply too generous as a family." Caroline sighed loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "We allow him into our inner circle, despite his obvious background and his lack of pedigree. Diana always had a terrible habit of picking up strays from the lower classes. We try to tolerate him, but as you can see, you cannot teach elegance to someone raised in the slums." He is practically begging Derek for handouts. The sheer venom of her racist, classist entitlement made my blood run ice cold. I stepped past a group of terrified investment bankers and walked directly up to the bar. Jamal saw me approach, his eyes widening in shock at my transformation. The helpless, submissive girl in cheap clothes was completely gone. I stopped right beside Derek, the rich silk of my midnight blue gown brushing against his legs. I reached out and gently took the heavy bottle of Merlot from Jamal's trembling hands. "Jamal," I said, my voice carrying a steady, soothing cadence, "you do not need to serve this man another drop." Derek whipped his head around, his eyes bulging as he finally registered my presence. "Isabella," he choked out, his arrogance momentarily short-circuiting at the sight of my bespoke gown and the cold authority radiating from my posture. "What are you doing here? Give me that bottle right now before I have security throw you down the elevator shaft." I did not hand him the bottle. I did not blink. I simply tilted the heavy glass neck forward and poured the dark crimson vintage directly over Derek's custom Tom Ford suit. The rich red wine splashed over his crisp white collar, soaking instantly into the expensive silk tie and running down the lapels of his immaculate jacket. A collective horrified gasp sucked all the air out of the penthouse. The splashing sound seemed to echo off the vaulted ceilings. Derek stood absolutely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of pure shock as the dark stains spread across his chest, ruining the $5,000 suit in a matter of seconds. I handed the empty bottle back to the stunned bartender and turned to face the silent, staring room. My voice rang out clear and unwavering, slicing through the heavy tension. "Jamal is not serving drinks tonight," I announced, projecting my words, so every single executive, socialite, and investor in the penthouse could hear me perfectly. "He is celebrating." Just 1 hour ago, I officially used my majority shareholder voting rights to restructure the entire executive board. I have personally appointed Jamal as the lead independent auditor of your parent corporation. He now holds absolute unhindered authority over every single financial ledger, offshore account, and hidden asset this firm possesses. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an entire financial empire holding its breath. Jamal stared at me, his eyes shining with sudden overwhelming realization. He was no longer the humiliated servant. He was the man holding the keys to Derek's destruction. Derek looked down at his ruined wine-soaked suit and then back up at me. A bizarre, strained noise escaped his throat. Slowly the noise morphed into a loud, frantic laugh. He wiped the dripping red wine from his face with the back of his hand, laughing maniacally as a vein throbbed violently in his forehead. "You!" he yelled, pointing a stained finger at my face. "You are a shareholder. You are completely delusional. You are a penniless street rat playing a pathetic prank. You have zero power here. Veronica's father is the CEO, and we are untouchable. We just launched a fully encrypted, unhackable billion-dollar cybersecurity system that protects all our assets. You cannot touch a single cent." I smiled, a slow, terrifying curve of the lips that made the manic laughter die instantly in his throat. "Oh, you mean Project Apex?" Veronica's face flushed a deep, venomous shade of crimson as the reality of my words settled over the murmuring crowd. She stepped out from behind Derek, smoothing the front of her designer gown, and signaled the audio-visual team stationed at the back of the penthouse. Instantly, the ambient jazz music faded into silence. 3 massive high-definition screens descended from the vaulted ceiling, glowing with a sleek, pulsating blue interface. The corporate logo of Veronica's father's firm was emblazoned across the top, but the center of the screen displayed a single glowing word: Apex. The crowd murmured in awe, their attention shifting from the wine-soaked spectacle of Derek to the glowing screens. Veronica threw her shoulders back, regaining her haughty posture. She gestured grandly to the displays. "You really thought you could come in here and intimidate us with a few financial tricks?" She sneered, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "This is Project Apex. It is the most advanced, impenetrable cybersecurity architecture ever developed. We are signing an exclusive billion-dollar defense contract with the federal government tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. It is completely unhackable. It is bulletproof. And it is going to make us richer than you could ever possibly comprehend." She walked slowly toward me, stopping just inches away, her eyes raking over my midnight blue gown with a look of pure disgust. "You are completely out of your depth here, Isabella. You are just a pathetic, jealous housewife trying to play a high-stakes game. Derek told me all about you. He told me how you used to sit in the dark, playing on some ancient broken laptop like a child, while he was out working 90-hour weeks, making the real money that put food on your table. You are a charity case who got lucky with a few lucky investments." I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. I let her finish her desperate, arrogant monologue. Then I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out a small, matte black titanium flash drive. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the light of the crystal chandeliers. "You are right about one thing, Veronica," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, echoing calm that forced the entire room to lean in and listen. "I did spend years working on a broken laptop in the dark while Derek was out pretending to be a titan of industry. But I was not playing games. I was building empires." I bypassed her entirely and walked straight toward the master control terminal resting on a sleek glass podium in the center of the room. The lead engineer tried to step in my way, but Elias simply shot him a freezing glare that rooted the man to the floor. I looked at the glowing blue screens, then turned back to Veronica and Derek. "You call Project Apex unhackable," I said, projecting my voice so every single investor could hear me. "You are selling this to the government tomorrow. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that your bulletproof architecture has a fatal catastrophic backdoor flaw programmed directly into line 4092 of the core sequence. It is a cascading vulnerability that allows anyone with the master key to bypass your firewalls, access your encrypted databases, and completely dismantle your network in less than 10 seconds. Derek scoffed loudly, wiping another drop of red wine from his ruined chin. Listen to yourself, he barked, his voice laced with manic desperation. You are just throwing around technical jargon you heard on television. You are a fraud, Isabella. Security, get her away from that terminal right now. I ignored him. I slid the titanium flash drive directly into the primary USB port of the control terminal. I did not type a single command. I did not press a single key. I simply stepped back and crossed my arms. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Derek let out a sharp, victorious laugh. You see, he yelled to the crowd. She is insane. She is a lunatic. He did not get to finish his sentence. The 3 massive high-definition screens suddenly flickered, the sleek blue interface distorted violently, tearing into jagged pixels of static. A harsh electronic hum buzzed through the penthouse speakers, silencing the room instantly. The screens went completely pitch black. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with impending dread. Then a single line of bright, glowing green text appeared in the dead center of the darkness. Welcome back, creator. The text dissolved, replaced by a massive rotating 3-dimensional wireframe logo. It was a silver wolf, the exact insignia of the anonymous legendary data forensics expert the global tech community had spent the last 5 years trying to identify. The expert, known only in elite circles as Apex. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several prominent tech investors dropped their champagne flutes. Murmurs of absolute disbelief escalated into panicked shouts. She is Apex! A venture capitalist near the front row gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. Isabella is Apex. They did not build that software. They stole it from her. The realization hit the room like a seismic shockwave. The brilliant anonymous coder who had single-handedly dismantled 3 international cyber syndicates was not a myth. She was the woman standing in the center of the room, wearing a midnight blue gown, watching her enemies realize they had just walked into a trap of their own making. Total chaos erupted. Investors scrambled toward the exits, frantically pulling out their cell phones to cancel their funding wires. The government contract was completely dead, and the entire company was toxic. The absolute magnitude of the deception had completely shattered them. Veronica stumbled backward again, her face ashen, furiously dialing her lawyers. Derek points a trembling finger at Isabella. I will sue you for industrial espionage. You are going to rot in federal prison, Derek screamed, his voice cracking as security guards rushed out of the elevators. I did not even look back at his red, wine-stained face. Elias placed one hand on the small of my back and guided me out of the penthouse. The doors slid shut on his complete humiliation. 48 hours later, the high of that victory evaporated when a heavy fist pounded on my apartment door. A gruff man in a wrinkled jacket shoved a thick manila envelope against my chest the moment I turned the lock. You have been served, he muttered, turning on his heel. I stood in the doorway, staring at the terrifying bold print. It was a temporary restraining order, accompanied by a massive $10 million federal civil lawsuit. Derek and Veronica had clearly moved fast, draining whatever capital they had left to hire Marcus Sterling, a ruthless Manhattan legal shark known for completely destroying opponents before they even saw the inside of a courtroom. I walked to the kitchen island and opened the document. The sheer malice radiating from the legal text made my stomach twist. It was not just a lawsuit, it was a calculated, vicious character assassination. Derek had weaponized every vulnerable detail of my past. The filing explicitly highlighted my lack of formal university degrees and my childhood in the foster system, twisting my survival into evidence of deep psychological instability. They painted a horrific picture of a deranged, jealous housewife who had suffered a complete psychotic break after being righteously abandoned by her successful, wealthy husband. The documents claimed I was a dangerous cyberstalker who had spent years obsessively tracking Derek's movements and illegally hacking into his firm's secure servers to sabotage his brilliant career out of pure bitter spite. They demanded the immediate seizure of all my electronics, a lifetime gag order, and $10 million in punitive damages for stealing highly classified trade secrets. Derek was terrified of the Apex revelation, and this was his desperate attempt to silence me by burying me under a mountain of legal debt. I threw the papers into my bag and took a cab to Elias' office in the financial district. The walls of his firm were lined with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city. I dropped the thick stack of papers onto his immaculate mahogany desk. My hands were shaking slightly. "They want 10 million, Elias," I said, my voice tight. "They are painting me as an unhinged criminal stalker who fabricated the entire Apex identity just to ruin Veronica's engagement party." Elias did not look worried. He picked up the heavy legal filing, his eyes scanning the aggressive accusations. He read the vicious paragraphs detailing my orphanage background and my supposed lack of education. A slow, dark smirk spread across his handsome face. He stood up, walked over to an industrial shredder in the corner of his office, and casually dropped the entire $10 million lawsuit into the machine. The loud, whirring sound of grinding paper filled the room. I stared at him in complete shock. "You just shredded a federal court summons," I yelled. "Are you insane?" Elias brushed a speck of dust from his tailored lapel and sat back down, leaning his elbows on the desk. "Isabella," he said, his tone entirely too calm. "Derek is an arrogant fool who hired a loud, aggressive lawyer to bully you. But in his absolute desperation to silence you, he just handed us the exact weapon we needed to completely destroy his firm. He filed a federal lawsuit regarding corporate cyber espionage." I shook my head, not understanding. "What does that mean?" "It means Derek just triggered an automatic federal e-discovery mandate," Elias explained, his eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. "By formally accusing you of hacking his proprietary systems and stealing trade secrets, he is now legally required to submit his entire internal server architecture to the court for a comprehensive digital forensics audit. He thought he was locking you out, but he actually just gave us a federal warrant to legally kick the doors in. Every single deleted email, every hidden offshore transaction, and every manipulated pension ledger is now officially open season. We do not have to hack him anymore. The federal government is going to hand us all his data on a silver platter." The sheer brilliance of the trap Derek had blindly stumbled into left me speechless. He had been so focused on crushing my reputation that he completely exposed his own criminal underbelly. "We just need the internal access codes to guide the federal auditors exactly where to look," Elias said, tapping a silver pen against his desk. "And I believe our inside man has already secured them." Later that evening, the damp air of a dimly lit underground parking garage chilled my skin. Elias stood silently by my side as tires screeched on the concrete ramp above us. A dark sedan pulled into the shadows and killed its headlights. Jamal stepped out, moving quickly and cautiously. He still wore his wrinkled white serving shirt from the disastrous gala, but his posture was entirely different now. He was no longer the humiliated victim. He was a man on a very specific mission. He walked right up to us and pulled a heavily worn black leather-bound ledger from beneath his jacket, handing it directly into my two waiting palms. I bypassed the digital firewalls and pulled the hard copy archives. Jamal whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "You were right to make me the lead auditor, Isabella. The numbers in their system are completely fabricated." I stared down at the thick book, feeling a sudden terrible weight settling in my chest. "What did you find?" I asked softly. Jamal looked me dead in the eyes. "They did not just steal from the pension fund. They stole from your dead father's hidden estate." The words hung in the freezing air of the concrete parking garage, echoing against the damp walls. I stared down at the heavy black ledger in my hands, my fingers tracing the worn leather binding. My father had died when I was just a young teenager, leaving me at the mercy of the foster system. Derek had always told me my father died bankrupt debts that Derek himself had paid off. He had played the white knight while raiding a fortune that rightfully belonged to me. 2 weeks later, the cold, sterile air of a midtown legal conference room pressed against my skin. I sat at a massive mahogany table, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Across from me sat Derek, looking smug in a slate-gray designer suit. Beside him sat Marcus Sterling, the ruthless, high-profile legal shark Derek and Veronica had hired to obliterate my existence. Sterling was a predator in a pinstripe suit, pacing the length of the room with a predatory gleam in his eyes. Sterling stopped abruptly and slammed a thick, disorganized pile of faded, crumpled papers directly onto the polished wood in front of me. I looked down. They were ancient grocery receipts, pharmacy bills, and faded credit card slips for baby formula and cheap generic diapers. Sterling spread them out with the tip of his expensive pen, arranging them like pieces of damning criminal evidence. "Let the record reflect," Sterling began, his voice dripping with theatrical condescension, "that the defendant Isabella was entirely financially dependent on her husband for the entirety of their marriage. Look at these receipts. You could not even afford basic household supplies without Mr. Derek's bank accounts. You were a stay-at-home mother, a woman who required an allowance just to keep the lights on." He leaned over the table, placing his palms flat on the wood, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. "Is it true, Mrs. Isabella, that your highest formal qualification is a high school diploma, and you relied entirely on Mr. Derek for your survival?" Derek snickered loudly from his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "She barely even managed the high school diploma," Derek added, making sure the court stenographer caught every single word. "I took her out of a pathetic, miserable life. She had absolutely nothing. Now she is having a hysterical, paranoid breakdown because I finally left her making up wild, psychotic delusions about being some elite cyber hacker." I sat perfectly still, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not let a single ounce of anger show on my face. I let the silence stretch out, letting Sterling's arrogant question hang in the air. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were building a narrative of a fragile, unhinged, dependent woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. "I will wait for your answer, Mrs. Isabella." Sterling pushed, tapping the table. "Is it true that you possess no higher education, no technical degrees, and no professional background whatsoever?" Before I could even open my mouth to respond, the heavy double oak doors of the conference room swung violently open. They hit the wall with a loud, echoing crack. Elias strolled into the room, impeccably dressed in a sharp charcoal suit carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. He moved with a relaxed, dangerous grace, entirely unbothered by the furious glares directed at him by the opposing legal team. "Apologies for my tardiness," Elias announced, his voice smooth and commanding as he pulled out the leather chair directly beside me. "Traffic on FDR Drive was absolutely abysmal this morning. Let the record show that Elias Thorne is officially stepping in as lead counsel for the defendant." Sterling stood up straight, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "You cannot simply barge into a closed deposition, Mr. Thorne. This is highly irregular. We are in the middle of establishing the defendant's lack of credible qualifications and her complete psychological instability." "Oh, I am fully aware of what you are attempting to establish," Elias replied, clicking his briefcase open. "But we are no longer here to discuss my client's grocery receipts from 7 years ago. We are completely changing the scope of this deposition." Elias did not pull out defense papers. He did not pull out character witness statements. Instead, he pulled out a massive, heavily bound legal document and dropped it onto the center of the table with a resounding thud. The sheer weight of the paper made Derek flinch in his seat. "This is a formal countersuit," Elias stated, sliding the document across the polished mahogany until it hit Sterling's hands. "We are charging your client Derek, alongside his current fiancée Veronica, with systemic corporate fraud, grand larceny, and the direct embezzlement of $40 million from a protected estate." Sterling scoffed, waving a dismissive hand at the massive document. "This is a desperate, pathetic stall tactic. Your client is an uneducated housewife claiming to be a legendary cybersecurity expert. She has absolutely zero proof, zero credibility, and zero technical qualifications to back up these absurd defamatory claims." Elias smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that instantly drained the color from Derek's face. Elias reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, thick plastic card attached to a woven black lanyard. He placed it casually onto the center of the table. It slid across the wood and stopped right on top of the pile of baby formula receipts. It was a heavily redacted CIA contractor badge. My real credentials. The seal stamped in gold. Sterling stared at the small badge, his mouth open, the aggressive bluster completely vanishing from him. Derek sneered, his voice shaking with panic. Fake badges won't save her. Then Elias pressed play on a tape. It's Veronica's voice explicitly detailing how to launder the stolen pension money through an offshore account. The recording echoed through the deposition room, undeniably clear. Veronica meticulously explained the exact routing numbers needed to funnel the stolen estate funds through a Cayman Island shell company. Sterling turned the color of ash. He scrambled to shut off the recorder, but Elias slammed his hand over the device, eyes locked onto Derek. Sterling declared the deposition over threatening motions to suppress the audio, but the damage was irreversible. Derek, blinded by his ego, stubbornly refused to settle or withdraw his baseless lawsuit. He genuinely believed his wealth could bully a federal judge into ignoring the mounting evidence. 3 weeks later, we stood inside a cavernous, federal courtroom. The mahogany panels were designed to intimidate, but I had never felt more at home. Derek and Veronica sat at the plaintiff's table playing the tragic, victimized couple to absolute perfection. Veronica took the witness stand first, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She spun a harrowing, entirely fabricated tale of my supposed jealousy. She told the judge, Honorable Davis, that I had cornered her in the penthouse elevator, physically threatening her life if she did not call off the engagement. Veronica forced a dramatic sob, clutching her chest, painting herself as a terrified woman, living in constant fear of an unhinged woman. Derek was called to the stand next, adjusting his tie and projecting the image of a weary, exhausted genius. Sterling led him through rehearsed questions, building the grand illusion that Derek was the sole architect of the firm's monumental success. When asked about the proprietary Apex software protecting their wealthy client assets, Derek puffed his chest. He testified under oath that he had entirely coded the encryption architecture from scratch. I spent hundreds of sleepless nights in my study, fueled by black coffee and sheer determination, Derek declared, shooting a look of pure disgust in my direction. While my former wife slept lazily down the hall, contributing absolutely nothing to our household or my career, I was writing the code that revolutionized our security protocols. She did not even know how to turn on the home router, let alone comprehend cybersecurity algorithms. I leaned over to Elias and whispered that it was time. Elias stood respectfully, asking Judge Davis if the defense could ask the witness a single technical question regarding the software he supposedly created. Sterling immediately objected, claiming it was irrelevant harassment, but Judge Davis overruled him, clearly intrigued. Elias turned the floor over to me. I stood up, holding my laptop. I walked toward the center of the room, locking eyes with Derek. Mr. Derek, I started, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Because you claim to be the sole author of the Apex encryption protocol, could you please explain to the entire court how you resolved the hash collision vulnerability within the localized block cipher? Did you employ a salting method or rewrite the key derivation function entirely? Derek froze. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sudden panic. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Sterling, but his lawyer was furiously flipping through legal notes, completely out of his depth. Derek swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. I utilized a standard patch, he stammered, his voice lacking all its previous commanding authority. The technical specifics are buried in my old hard drives, which I do not have access to at this exact moment. That is fascinating, I replied, opening my laptop. Because a true developer would know that the Apex cipher does not use a localized block method at all. It operates on a continuous stream cipher matrix. You just failed a basic trick question. Sterling shot to his feet, shouting another frantic objection, but I had already executed the command protocol on my keyboard. I had synced my laptop to the courtroom's evidence presentation system. Instantly, every large monitor mounted on the walls flashed a blinding red. The entire room gasped. Overriding Derek's software demonstration, a massive digital watermark pulsed on the screens for everyone, including the judge, to see clearly. It read, "Intellectual property of Apex unauthorized usage detected. Security override initiated." I looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, the software running Mr. Derek's firm contains a dormant watermark that I embedded 7 years ago. A watermark that can only be triggered by the original source code author. He did not write a single line of that software. He stole it from me just as he stole from my father's estate." Judge Davis took off her reading glasses, her eyes narrowing into a lethal glare directed at the witness stand. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and heavy with impending doom. Derek sat frozen in the witness chair, visibly trembling as the realization of his catastrophic perjury crashed down upon him. He had lied under oath in a federal court claiming ownership of stolen intellectual property, and I had just proved it. Judge Davis picked up her wooden gavel, leaning forward over the bench. Her voice was cold and sharp. "Mr. Derek, I am preparing to hold you in direct contempt of this court for blatant perjury and grand intellectual property theft." Derek opened his mouth to beg, his previous arrogance completely eviscerated, but before the wooden gavel could strike the block, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly burst wide open. The crash echoed through the high ceilings, snapping everyone's attention away from the bench. Caroline stormed down the center aisle, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. Her hair was uncharacteristically messy, and her breath was coming in ragged gasps, but her eyes burned with absolute triumph. She ignored the bailiffs rushing to intercept her and marched directly toward the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the trial floor. In her right hand, she was frantically waving a thick, sealed yellow document that looked like it had been buried in a vault for decades. Caroline slammed the heavy parchment onto the wooden barricade separating the gallery. She breathed heavily, her designer blouse wrinkled and her eyes darting. The bailiff stepped forward, reaching for his belt, but Judge Davis raised a hand, signaling him to hold. The audacity of the interruption silenced the federal courtroom. Derek slumped, sitting up straight. A flicker of hope ignited across his face. Veronica leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table. "Order in my courtroom," Judge Davis commanded, her voice echoing. "Identify yourself immediately and explain this outburst before I arrest you for contempt." "I am Caroline," she declared, thrusting her chin into the air, "mother to the plaintiff Derek, and I hold the absolute truth about this liar." She turned her head, locking her furious gaze directly onto me. Her lip curled into a sneer. "A rat remains a rat. She forged her way into this money. This document proves she is a penniless fraud." Sterling saw a lifeline. He rushed over to Caroline, snatching the document from her hands. His eyes scanned the text, and I watched the color return to his face. He looked up at the judge, a smirk spreading across his features. "Your Honor," Sterling announced, his voice booming, "this appears to be a discovered last will and testament belonging to the defendant's late father. According to this sworn document executed shortly before his passing, he explicitly disinherited his daughter Isabella. He transferred all rights, titles, and interests of his estate to his estranged, distant relatives." Caroline nodded, stepping closer to the barricade. "Exactly. Her father knew she was completely unstable. He knew she was a worthless liability. He stripped her of everything. She has absolutely no legal right to any offshore trusts or to the $40 million she is falsely accusing my son of embezzling. Derek was simply managing the funds for the rightful heirs just as her father requested." The gallery erupted into whispers. Veronica let out a dramatic gasp of relief, pressing her hands to her chest. Derek leaned back in his leather chair, the arrogant smirk returning to his face as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. They thought they had won. They thought this dusty, forged piece of paper was their ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. I did not gasp. I did not panic. I did not even shift my posture. I sat perfectly still, maintaining an icy calm that seemed to unsettle Sterling as he glanced in my direction. I slowly turned my head to look at Elias. Elias was leaning back in his chair. There was no alarm in his eyes. There was no scrambling to review legal statutes. Instead, there was a quiet, predatory stillness about him. I knew exactly what that look meant. Elias had waited 10 years for this exact piece of paper to surface. He knew Derek and Caroline were arrogant enough to use it when backed into a corner. They had just walked into a trap that had been set a decade ago. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Davis said, looking down at Elias with a raised eyebrow. "Opposing counsel is presenting evidence that directly contradicts your client standing to sue for the embezzled estate funds. Do you have a response to this dramatic revelation?" Elias stood up slowly, adjusting his cuffs. "Your Honor, I do have a response. However, since Caroline has physically interrupted a federal proceeding to submit material evidence, I request that she immediately be sworn in under oath. If she wishes to enter this document into the official court record, she must testify to its origin right here and right now." Sterling frowned, sensing a trap, but the temptation to obliterate my credibility was too strong to resist. He nodded eagerly to the judge. "We welcome the opportunity, Your Honor. Let the mother of the plaintiff verify this discovery." Judge Davis gestured to the court clerk. Caroline marched through the wooden gate and took her place at the witness stand, her head held high. She raised her right hand and eagerly swore to tell the whole truth. She looked at me with a victorious, gloating expression, completely unaware of the invisible noose tightening around her neck. Elias approached the witness stand. He held out his hand, and Sterling reluctantly passed him the yellowed document. Elias did not even bother reading the text. He simply held it delicately between his fingers, examining the texture of the paper. "Mrs. Thorne," Elias began, his voice smooth and echoing through the silent room. "You are under oath. I need you to be absolutely certain about the answers you are about to give. Do you verify that this document is 100% authentic?" "I absolutely do," Caroline answered proudly, her voice ringing with defiance. "It is the true and final will of Isabella's father." "Fascinating," Elias murmured, pacing slowly in front of the stand. "And could you please tell the court exactly where you found this legal document?" Caroline lifted her chin, shooting a proud glance at Derek. "I found it secured inside my son's hidden wall safe at his private residence. He had been keeping it there for years, protecting the true estate instructions from Isabella and her greedy, manipulative hands. He knew she would try to steal the offshore trusts, so he kept the real will locked away where she could never find it." "So you are testifying under oath that Derek Thorne has possessed this document in his home safe for years?" Elias pressed his eyes, narrowing slightly. "Yes," Caroline declared, crossing her arms over her chest. "He has had it safely locked away for years." Elias stopped pacing. The demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by cold, calculating menace. He looked at Caroline. The entire federal courtroom watched in absolute stunned silence as the trap finally snapped shut around her arrogant neck. Elias smiles a lethal shark-like grin. "Thank you, Caroline. You just confessed to a federal crime." He points to the date on the paper. Elias tapped his pen on the corner of the parchment. The date stamped next to the forged signature read October 4th. Sterling leaned over to look, and all the blood drained from his face. He lunged across the rail, trying to snatch the document. "Withdraw!" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking with sudden raw panic. "The plaintiffs formally withdraw this document from the record. It was a mistake, a clerical error." "Sit down right now, Mr. Sterling," Judge Davis bellowed, slamming her wooden gavel. The crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. "You do not submit material evidence, then snatch it back when it becomes inconvenient. The document is already entered into the record. Explain yourself, Thorne." Caroline stood frozen at the witness stand, her triumphant smile dissolving into pure terror. She looked back at Derek, who was furiously tugging at his tie. The air in the courtroom shifted from tense to suffocating. Caroline had proudly sworn under oath that this document had been locked in a safe for years. She had confidently presented it to a federal judge. "Your Honor," Elias began, turning to face the bench. "This document is dated October 4th of the year Isabella's father died, but her father passed away on October 2nd. It is a sloppy forgery. I know this with absolute certainty because I was there 10 years ago when the Thorne family orchestrated the theft of the real will. A gasp swept through the packed gallery. Derek leaped to his feet, but a sharp look from the bailiff forced him back down. 10 years ago, Elias continued pacing slowly across the marble floor. I was a young legal intern working for a firm that handled municipal records. I was sent to the orphanage where Isabella had been unfairly placed. I arrived late in the evening during a terrible storm to deliver routine filing paperwork. While waiting in the dark corridor, I witnessed Derek and Caroline Thorne sitting inside the director's private office. They handed over a heavy canvas duffel bag containing $200,000 in unmarked cash. They bribed the greedy director to seal Isabella's records and hide the true will of her father. He was an eccentric, highly successful tech billionaire who had built the very foundational code that Derek later stole. Caroline gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand, her knuckles turning stark white. Lies. He is making this up. He has absolutely no proof. You bought a destitute orphan's fortune for a fraction of its true worth, Elias stated, his voice turning lethal. You thought because Isabella was young and alone, no one would ever care enough to investigate. You thought her father was just a crazy paranoid coder, but his brilliant paranoia is exactly what brings us here today. He knew you were circling his massive wealth like hungry vultures. Elias turned his attention back to the massive digital screens mounted on the courtroom walls. He tapped a command sequence on his tablet. The red security warning vanished, replaced by a complex cryptographic hash. It was a long, unbroken string of letters and numbers cascading rapidly down the high-resolution displays. Isabella's father did not trust paper, Elias declared, pointing confidently to the screen. He was a visionary pioneer in decentralized networking. Before his untimely death, he embedded his true, authentic will directly into an immutable blockchain smart contract. It has been sitting securely on the public ledger for a decade, waiting for the exact execution date to trigger. No one could ever alter it. No one could forge it, and no one could erase it from the global network. Elias picked up Caroline's yellowed document and placed it precisely under the evidence scanner mounted on the plaintiff's table. The image of the forged will appeared clearly on the secondary screens for the judge to see. Now let us examine the brilliant forgery Caroline Thorne just swore under oath was completely authentic, Elias said, tapping another command. A specialized artificial intelligence forensic software flooded the screen, overlaying the scanned document with a glowing digital grid. The advanced software zoomed in, magnifying the blank spaces between the typed paragraphs. Tiny, barely visible yellow dots appeared highlighted on the bright monitors. These are microscopic machine identification codes, Elias explained to the stunned, silent courtroom. Tracking dots automatically printed by modern laser printers to track the precise origin of documents. The forensic AI has just thoroughly analyzed the ink composition and the dot matrix layout. This ancient document was not buried safely in a hidden safe for 10 years. It was freshly printed exactly 3 days ago. Judge Davis leaned forward, her eyes wide as she read the undeniable data populating on her personal monitor. Furthermore, Elias announced, his voice rising over the sudden frantic murmurs of the gallery, the IP address embedded in the printer log traces back directly to one specific location, Derek's private corner office in Manhattan. They panicked when we demanded the server audit and manufactured this fake disinheritance document to stop the financial probe. This is an absolute outrage, Sterling yelled wildly, throwing his hands in the air. We are being framed. You are going to federal prison, Judge Davis roared, her face flushed with absolute righteous fury. She pointed her wooden gavel directly at Derek and Caroline. Bailiffs, secure those doors right now. No one leaves this courtroom. I am holding the plaintiff and his mother in direct criminal contempt. The heavy clicking of deadbolts echoed loudly as the armed court officers moved swiftly to lock the main entrances. Derek looked wildly around the room. His carefully constructed empire of lies had just instantly vaporized. He saw the bailiffs reaching for their steel handcuffs. The pure survival instinct of a cornered, terrified animal kicked in. Derek violently shoved his own mother out of his way, sending Caroline crashing hard into the advancing bailiffs. He grabbed Veronica by her arm, ignoring her terrified scream, and sprinted desperately toward the side exit of the courtroom. Caroline hit the polished marble floor with a sickening thud, her designer skirt tearing along the seam as the force of her own son's brutal shove sent her sliding directly into the boots of the advancing federal bailiffs. The entire courtroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. The heavy oak side doors slammed shut behind Derek and Veronica, their frantic footsteps echoing down the exterior corridor. Caroline scrambled to her hands and knees, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her eyes wide with a manic, uncomprehending terror. She reached out her hand toward the closed exit, her voice cracking into a desperate, guttural shriek that pierced the chaotic noise of the gallery. "Derek, Derek, come back. Do not leave me here, Derek." But the doors remained tightly shut. He had sacrificed her without a single fraction of a second's hesitation to save his own skin. Two burly federal bailiffs immediately descended upon Caroline, grabbing her arms and hauling her roughly to her feet. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the officer's shins, refusing to accept the catastrophic reality of her situation. Judge Davis was hammering her gavel, continuously shouting over the uproar for order, instructing the clerks to lock down the courthouse and coordinate with federal marshals to intercept the fleeing fugitives. "Unhand me, you absolute imbeciles!" Caroline shrieked, spitting blindly at the officers trying to restrain her. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea who my family is? I am a thorn." The cold, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists silenced her momentary struggle. Her arms were wrenched forcefully behind her back. For a brief second, the sheer indignity of the metal restraints seemed to paralyze her. But as the bailiffs began dragging her aggressively toward the holding cells at the rear of the courtroom, her panic mutated into a vile, venomous rage. Her eyes darted wildly around the room until they locked onto the gallery where my husband Jamal was standing. Jamal had been sitting quietly in the back row for the entire proceeding, watching the Thorne family unravel from a safe distance. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, projecting an aura of absolute calm that completely contrasted with Caroline's deranged hysteria. Seeing him standing there composed and victorious triggered a deeply ingrained repulsive hatred inside Caroline. She dug her heels into the floor, forcing the bailiffs to literally drag her dead weight, and began screaming across the room. "You think you have won, you filthy trash?" Caroline roared, her face contorting into an ugly, hateful snarl, unleashing a barrage of classist and racist slurs that made even the hardened court reporters flinch in disgust. "You belong in the gutters. You are nothing but street garbage. Both of you. You think some fake computer tricks and a cheap lawyer can take down our empire. My son will destroy you both. He will bury you so deep you will never see the light of day again." Her voice echoed violently off the high mahogany ceilings, a pathetic and vile display of a woman who had lost every ounce of her power and had nothing left but her deeply rooted prejudice. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer any reaction that would give her the satisfaction of knowing her venomous words had even registered. I stood perfectly straight at the plaintiff's table, my hands resting lightly on the smooth wood, watching her unravel. Jamal slowly stepped forward from the gallery row. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, walking down the center aisle until he stood just inches away from the wooden barricade. He looked down at Caroline. His expression was completely devoid of anger or hatred. Instead, he looked at her with a chilling, profound pity that seemed to infuriate her even more. "Your son just violently shoved you to the ground to save himself," Jamal said, his voice carrying clearly over the lingering murmurs of the courtroom. "He just left you behind to take the fall for his massive financial crimes. You are going to face a 20-year sentence for federal forgery, perjury, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You are going to face it completely alone. Enjoy prison, Caroline." Caroline opened her mouth to scream another insult, but the words died in her throat. The absolute finality in Jamal's voice finally pierced through her delusion. The bailiffs jerked her arms, yanking her forward through the heavy doors leading to the holding cells. I watched coldly, my expression carved from stone, as the woman who had tormented me, who had bribed orphanage directors and who had tried to steal my father's entire legacy, was dragged away, kicking and screaming into the dark corridor. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, cutting off her hysterical wails. Judge Davis was already barking orders to the federal marshals organizing a statewide manhunt for Derek and Veronica. Elias stood beside me, packing his legal documents into his briefcase. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, but the war was not over yet. Derek was a desperate man, and desperate men with access to massive amounts of capital were dangerous. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of his phone sliced through our conversation. He pulled it from his pocket, checking the caller ID. He raised an eyebrow, accepting the call, and pressing the phone to his ear. He listened intently for several seconds, his jaw tightening into a hard line. He did not say a word, only nodding before ending the call and slipping the phone back into his jacket. He turned to me, the triumphant spark in his eyes replaced by a cold intensity. "That was my private investigator," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper that only Jamal and I could hear. "Derek and Veronica are heading straight to the corporate headquarters now. They are trying to initiate the scorched earth protocol to drain offshore company accounts before fleeing." 30 minutes later, inside the soaring glass and steel headquarters of the investment firm, panic consumed the executive floor. The panoramic windows offered a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline, but the three people inside the boardroom were completely blind to the beauty. They were running out of time. Derek burst through the double doors, his expensive suit jacket discarded somewhere in the hallway. His chest heaved as he threw his laptop onto the massive marble conference table. Veronica trailed closely behind him, her face pale and her hands shaking as she clutched a leather portfolio of offshore routing numbers. Waiting for them at the head of the table was Richard Vance, Veronica's father and the CEO of the firm. Richard was a man who usually commanded a room with quiet, intimidating authority. Right now, his face was a mask of purple vein-popping fury. This was not a scheduled meeting. It was a panicked, illegal emergency board assembly, consisting solely of the three executives desperately trying to salvage their stolen empire. Richard slammed his fists onto the polished marble table, making the crystal water glasses rattle. "You told me you handled that orphan," Richard bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Derek's face. "You stood in my office 10 years ago and swore to me that the records were sealed. You promised me that the old man's original code was ours, free and clear. Now my entire legacy is in ruins because you could not control your own pathetic wife. Do not put this entirely on me." Derek sneered furiously, typing authorization codes into his laptop. He did not even bother to look up at his father-in-law. "You were the one who happily built this firm on top of her father's encryption matrix. You knew exactly where the software came from. You loved the profit margins it generated. So stop acting like a victim and just sign the wire transfer. Let her inherit a completely bankrupt shell." Veronica paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, chewing nervously on her thumbnail. "Derek is right, Dad. We cannot undo what happened in the courtroom. We just need to execute the Scorched Earth Protocol right now. The buyer in Dubai is standing by. They are offering exactly $50 million in untraceable cryptocurrency for the remaining liquid assets and the offshore shell company portfolios. Once the transfer clears, we catch the private charter to the Cayman Islands. They will never be able to extradite us." Richard glared at his daughter, then back at Derek. The sheer reality of abandoning his life's work clearly disgusted him, but the alternative was a federal prison cell. He snatched a digital key fob from his pocket and plugged it into the central console of the boardroom table to authorize the massive corporate sale. "Lock the physical doors!" Derek commanded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Veronica engaged the network firewall. "Block all incoming external traffic to the corporate servers. We need exactly 3 minutes to complete the cryptocurrency routing sequence." Veronica sprinted to the entrance, slamming her hand against the electronic security panel on the wall. The heavy magnetic locks engaged with a solid, heavy thud, sealing the three of them inside the soundproof glass enclosure. She then rushed to the auxiliary terminal, activating the internal security blackout protocols. Derek wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. The progress bar on his screen showed the $50 million transfer initiating. The funds were being rapidly pulled from dozens of mutual accounts, retirement funds, and hidden trusts, funneling into a single master node for the final overseas jump. "It is working," Derek muttered, a manic grin spreading across his face. 50 seconds until the blockchain confirms the transaction. Isabella can have the empty servers. We are taking the actual wealth. Richard watched the main overhead monitor where the transfer status was mirrored. Just make sure the routing bounces through the proxy servers. If the feds track the destination wallet, we are dead before the plane even lands. "I built this network," Derek snapped, arrogant even in his panic. "I know exactly how to bypass the monitoring algorithms." But Derek did not build the network. He had stolen it. And that fundamental truth was about to deliver its final fatal blow. The progress bar on the massive overhead screen hit 90%. Then it froze. Derek frowned aggressively, tapping the enter key. "Come on, push through the final node." Suddenly, the progress bar vanished entirely, the bright blue corporate interface glitch violently pixelating into a sea of static. Derek let out a sharp curse, furiously typing override commands into his terminal. Nothing responded. The keys were completely dead. Veronica screamed, backing away from her auxiliary terminal. "Derek, my screen just locked. The keyboard is completely unresponsive." "Reboot the localized server," Richard shouted, slapping his hand against the table. "Do it right now." "I cannot," Derek yelled, staring at his laptop in absolute horror. "The administrative credentials have been revoked. The system is rejecting my localized access tokens." Every single screen in the luxurious boardroom abruptly shifted from static to a stark, blinding white background. Bold crimson letters materialized across the monitors, glowing with a sinister finality. The message blinked rhythmically, illuminating their terrified faces in rhythmic flashes of red light. "Audit in progress. Assets frozen. Security override initiated by primary architect." "No," Derek whispered, his voice cracking. "No, this is impossible. The internal firewall was engaged. No one can breach the server from the outside." "Then they are not on the outside." Richard roared, his panic finally boiling over into pure terror. He grabbed Derek by the lapels of his wrinkled shirt, shaking him violently. "Who did this? Who froze the accounts? We are trapped in here with a frozen network. Shams." Before Derek could even attempt to answer, the heavy rhythmic thud of deliberate footsteps echoed loudly in the marble hallway outside. The sound cut through the frantic silence of the locked boardroom. The footsteps were not rushed. They were calm, steady, and carrying the immense weight of inevitable consequence. They stopped directly outside the frosted glass walls. Richard released Derek, spinning around to face the entrance. Veronica backed into the corner, clutching her portfolio against her chest. The reinforced glass doors of the boardroom were kicked violently open. The shattered glass cascaded across the polished marble floor like a violent rainstorm. The heavy reinforced doors, designed to withstand a bomb blast, hung twisted off their titanium hinges. Standing in the center of the ruined doorway was Jamal. He was no longer the quiet, mistreated husband, sitting silently in the back row of a federal courtroom. He stood tall, his posture radiating an absolute, unyielding authority that immediately sucked the remaining oxygen out of the luxurious boardroom. Flanking him on either side were two imposing federal agents, their hands resting cautiously on their tactical belts, their faces carved from stone. Veronica let out a piercing shriek, scrambling backward until her spine hit the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Richard froze, his hand still hovering uselessly over the locked central console. Derek stared at the doorway, his eyes darting frantically between Jamal and the federal agents. The sheer shock of the intrusion momentarily paralyzed him, but Derek's deeply ingrained arrogance quickly overpowered his self-preservation instincts. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson as he pointed a shaking finger toward the ruined entrance. "Security!" Derek roared, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. "Get this thug out of my building right now. You have absolutely no right to be up here." Jamal did not even blink. He stepped over the shattered glass, his leather shoes crunching methodically against the debris, and walked directly into the center of the boardroom. The two federal agents followed, stepping cleanly into the room and fanning out to block any potential exit. Derek scoffed, his upper lip curling into a desperate, ugly sneer. He looked at Richard, attempting to project a false sense of superiority. "Do you see this, Richard? This is exactly what I warned you about. This is Isabella's pathetic husband. He is nothing but a street hustler from a broke neighborhood trying to intimidate us. He has been jealous of my success since the day we met. He is just a disgruntled poor relative looking for a massive handout because he cannot make it in the real world." Derek turned his furious gaze back to Jamal, his chest heaving. "You think you can just march into a private corporate facility and demand a piece of our pie? You belong in the gutters, Jamal. I will have you arrested for breaking and entering." Richard narrowed his eyes, his breathing heavy as he tried to regain control of his boardroom. He puffed out his chest, attempting to channel the ruthless CEO persona that had built his investment empire. "Listen to me very carefully, young man," Richard commanded, jabbing his finger toward the elevator banks. "You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around, take your hired muscle, and walk out of my firm before I press the silent alarm and have my private security team throw you out the nearest window. This is a highly classified proprietary corporate meeting. You are trespassing on private property, and I will personally see to it that you spend the next 10 years rotting in a state penitentiary for corporate espionage and corporate sabotage." Jamal stopped at the edge of the massive marble table. He looked at Richard, then at Veronica cowering against the glass, and finally at Derek. A slow, chilling smile spread across Jamal's face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a hunter, watching his prey finally run out of places to hide. He reached slowly into the inside breast pocket of his tailored navy suit jacket. Derek flinched instinctively, taking a step backward, terrified of what Jamal might pull out. Jamal withdrew a sleek black leather wallet. He flipped it open with a sharp, practiced flick of his wrist and held it up for the entire room to see. A heavy, solid gold shield gleamed harshly under the fluorescent boardroom lights. The federal seal was unmistakable. "I do not work for you, Derek," Jamal stated, his voice ringing out with icy, devastating clarity. "I do not work for your security team, and I certainly do not work for your father-in-law. I work for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, and you are officially under federal investigation for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international corporate espionage." Jamal reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavy binder. He slammed the 500-page dossier directly onto the center of the mahogany table. The violent thud made all three executives jump. "That is your entire financial history," Jamal declared, tapping the thick binder. "Every hidden offshore account, every single illegal wire transfer, every manipulated ledger you used to bleed your clients dry. We have been tracking your digital footprint for 18 months. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged, terrified breathing of Veronica. Derek stared at the gold badge, his mouth hanging open, as the reality of his total destruction finally crashed down upon him. The racist, classist insults he had hurled just moments ago now hung in the air like a definitive seal on his own coffin. He had completely underestimated the man standing in front of him. Richard, sweating bullets and visibly trembling, realized the federal net had completely closed around his legacy. His panicked eyes darted wildly toward his locked auxiliary terminal, searching for any possible escape route from the impending doom. Blind desperation completely clouded his normally sharp judgment. He aggressively lunged toward the glowing keyboard, his trembling fingers hovering over the glass screen. "This is an internal corporate matter," Richard shouted, his voice shrill with raw panic as he attempted to bypass the federal lockdown. "I am the chief executive officer of this firm, and I am signing the international sale order right now." Suddenly, a calm, icy voice rang out from the completely shattered doorway, cutting through the chaos like a sharpened blade. "You cannot simply sell off what you do not rightfully own." The shattered remnants of the reinforced glass doors rained down upon the plush carpet like a violent crystal waterfall. Through the settling dust of the destroyed entrance stepped Isabella. She moved with a glacial, terrifying calm that instantly dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Elias flanked her right side, matching her measured, unhurried pace perfectly. The two federal agents who had just accompanied Jamal parted seamlessly to allow her direct entry. Derek stumbled backward until his calves hit the edge of the mahogany conference table. All the color instantly vanished from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. He looked as though a ghost had just materialized from the floorboards. His jaw worked soundlessly up and down, but no words emerged from his throat. His eyes were wide with a primal, animalistic terror. He knew exactly what her presence here meant. The intricate web of lies he had woven for a decade was completely unraveling right in front of his eyes. Richard, however, did not share the young man's paralyzed terror. The older man practically vibrated with a deeply arrogant, indignant fury. His face morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his fist against the digital terminal, ignoring the blinking red warning screens. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Isabella's face. He commanded the federal agents to intervene immediately. He demanded they arrest her for trespassing on private property. He screamed that this was a secure corporate facility and that she had absolutely no legal authority to breach his executive sanctuary. He ordered Jamal to do his job and remove the intruders. Jamal simply stood by the wall, a faint, amused smile playing across his lips as he crossed his arms over his chest. He made absolutely no move to intervene. He was enjoying the show too much. The agents remained motionless, their faces carved from granite, completely ignoring Richard's frantic orders. Isabella ignored the shouting completely. She continued her slow, deliberate walk toward the head of the conference table. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble segments of the floor, echoing like a countdown clock in the enclosed space. Richard stepped aggressively into her path, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate her. He puffed out his chest, projecting the ruthless, predatory aura that had defined his entire cutthroat career. He looked her up and down with an expression of profound, manufactured disgust. He leaned forward, invading her personal space. "This is a boardroom for owner's little girl," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with a toxic, condescending venom. "Not for very greedy former wives looking for a quick settlement. You think because your husband brought some federal badges, you can march into my headquarters and demand a seat at the table. You are nothing. You are a footnote in my company history. You are a pathetic charity case that Derek should have left in the gutter where he found you. My empire is untouchable. I built this legacy from the ground up, and no street rat is going to waltz in here and take it from me. Get out of my building before I have you thrown out the window." Isabella did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. She stood perfectly still, letting his toxic words wash over her without leaving a single mark. She simply tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were a particularly pathetic specimen under a microscope. Her absolute silence seemed to unnerve Richard more than any screamed insult ever could. He breathed heavily, his face flushed a dangerous shade of magenta. He looked toward Derek, expecting his son-in-law to back him up to join the verbal assault. But Derek remained glued to the edge of the table, clutching the polished wood with white, trembling desperation. He shook his head frantically, silently, begging Richard to stop talking. "Show him," Isabella commanded simply. Elias stepped out from behind her. He unclasped the heavy leather satchel he carried and pulled out a massive, meticulously organized legal binder. With a swift, practiced motion, Elias slid the thick binder across the smooth expanse of the mahogany table. It glided effortlessly, stopping precisely inches from Richard's trembling hands. "Actually, Richard," Elias stated, his voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority, "your firm's primary liquidity provider is Vanguard Holdings, LLC, and the sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings is sitting right in front of you." Richard blinked rapidly. His eyes darted down to the highlighted signature line on the official document displayed in the open binder. His breathing stopped completely. He leaned closer, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he read the name printed clearly in black ink. Isabella Thorne. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse. He looked up at Isabella, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Isabella stepped gracefully around his frozen, paralyzed form. She walked directly to the oversized leather chair at the absolute head of the conference table. She turned, smoothing her tailored skirt, and sat down with the supreme confidence of a monarch reclaiming her stolen throne. She folded her hands, resting them on the table. "I own exactly 60% of this company," Isabella declared, her voice ringing out cold and utterly merciless. "You are all fired." Richard let out a strangled, agonizing gasp. He clutched his chest tightly, his face twisting into a mask of pure physical agony. The arrogant billionaire was completely broken. The monumental weight of his own greed and countless illegal decisions finally crushed his spirit. There was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. The entire room spun violently around him as his vision went entirely black. He stumbled blindly, falling back heavily into his plush leather executive chair as the catastrophic realization hit him that his entire empire now belonged entirely to the very woman his daughter had mercilessly tormented. Veronica, seeing the empire crumble to dust, suddenly turns her cold gaze on Derek. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Veronica stared at the frozen screens, her perfectly manicured fingernails biting into the expensive leather of her portfolio. The $50 million was gone. The private jet waiting on the tarmac was now nothing more than a useless piece of metal. She looked at her father, slumped and defeated in his chair, and then she looked at the federal agents guarding the shattered doorway. The stark, undeniable reality of a federal prison sentence crashed over her like a tidal wave of ice water. The sheer survival instinct that had always defined her kicked into overdrive. Veronica was a predator who understood exactly when to cut off a dying limb to save the rest of the body. She dropped her portfolio. She turned her cold, calculating gaze on Derek. He was backed against the table, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an escape route that did not exist. He looked like a pathetic liability. Veronica marched across the room. Derek barely had time to register her movement before she raised her right hand and struck him across the face with all the strength she possessed. The sudden loud crack of her palm against his cheek sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Derek stumbled backward, his hand flying to his face, his eyes wide with absolute shock. "How could you do this to me?" Veronica shrieked, her voice instantly transforming from a tone of calculating greed to one of hysterical, shattered innocence. Tears, genuine and heavy, immediately began streaming down her flawless cheeks. It was an absolutely masterful performance. She clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged, dramatic gasps, as she stumbled away from Derek, treating him as if he were a monster she was seeing for the very first time. She sank to the floor, her designer dress crumpling around her as she crawled desperately toward where Isabella sat at the head of the table. "He lied to me!" Veronica wailed, tears destroying her expensive mascara as she collapsed to her knees just inches from Isabella. She threw her hands up in a posture of total surrender. "I swear to you, I did not know anything about his actual life. I did not know he was still married. I did not know about you, and I certainly did not know about the baby. He told me he was a single, successful entrepreneur looking for a fresh start." Derek stared at her, his jaw completely unhinged. The sheer audacity of her lie left him momentarily paralyzed. He tried to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged from his throat. "He manipulated me." Veronica sobbed loudly, pointing a trembling finger at the man she had just planned to flee the country with. "He used my father's firm to hide his dirty money. He forced me to sign those offshore account authorizations. He told me it was standard corporate restructuring, and that if I did not authorize the transfers, he would ruin my family. Please, Isabella, you have to believe me. We are both victims of his psychotic manipulation. He used my heart just like he used yours. I am entirely innocent in this." The federal agents by the door remained completely impassive. Jamal leaned against the wall, crossing his arms, watching the theatrical display with a quiet, knowing smirk. Richard, still clutching his chest in his chair, watched his daughter throw the man he had groomed for succession directly under a federal bus. Isabella did not move. She sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather executive chair, her hands folded neatly on the mahogany table. She looked down at Veronica groveling on the floor. There was no anger in Isabella's eyes. There was no triumphant glee. There was only a profound, freezing disgust. She looked at Veronica the way one might look at a venomous snake that had just been safely locked inside a glass terrarium. She did not yell. She did not raise her voice. She simply broke eye contact with the sobbing woman and reached for the sleek silver laptop sitting in front of Elias. She pulled the device toward her, opened the lid, and typed in a swift sequence of commands. She grabbed the connection cable resting in the center of the table and calmly plugged it into the side of the machine. The massive projector mounted on the ceiling hummed to life. "Victim," Isabella said softly. The single word sliced through the room cold and sharp, instantly silencing Veronica's hysterical crying. "You want to play the victim now that the federal authorities are standing in your boardroom and your private jet has been grounded." Veronica swallowed hard, her fake tears drying up as a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She recognized the chilling certainty in Isabella's tone. "You claim you did not know about me." Isabella continued, her fingers moving deliberately across the trackpad. "You claim you did not know about the marriage, about the theft, or about the unborn baby. You want to present yourself as a tragic pawn in Derek's grand scheme." Isabella tapped the enter key. "Let us take a look at your heavily encrypted text messages from the night of the terrible storm," Isabella said, her voice echoing with lethal calm. "The exact night you claim you were completely ignorant of my very existence." The massive digital screens lining the walls of the boardroom flashed bright white before displaying a stark, high-resolution image. It was a digital extraction of a private, encrypted chat log. The screen lit up with a long text thread between two phone numbers. The names attached to the numbers were completely unmistakable: Derek and Veronica. The room gasped. Richard stopped clutching his chest, his eyes widening in pure horror as he read the undeniable, horrific words projected in massive black letters for everyone to see. They were reading Veronica's own words sent hours before Derek kicked Isabella out into the freezing rain. The black letters on the screen left no room for denial. The projected message stood as a stark monument to Veronica's ruthlessness. "Kick that pathetic orphan and her brat out into the storm. I do not want to see her face. Take the $2 million from the pension fund and let us go to Paris." Veronica let out a feral scream that tore through her victim persona. She scrambled to her feet, her heels slipping on the marble as she launched herself across the mahogany table. Her hands clawed desperately toward the silver laptop, aiming to smash the machine and destroy the digital evidence. She did not make it halfway. Two federal agents moved with terrifying synchronization. One grabbed her extended arm, while the other secured her waist, hauling her backward with undeniable force. They slammed her firmly into a leather chair, pinning her shoulders down. She thrashed wildly against their iron grip, her chest heaving, her flawless hair falling into her flushed face. "Those are fake!" Derek shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he pointed a shaking finger at the screen. He backed away, cold sweat pouring down his pale face. "You fabricated those messages. Anyone with basic computer skills can mock up a fake text thread. You are just a bitter, jealous former wife trying to frame us because you could not handle the fact that I moved on. Nobody is ever going to believe a digitally altered screenshot. You have no real proof." Isabella did not blink. She looked at Derek with clinical detachment and tapped a single key on her laptop. "You are right, Derek," Isabella stated, her voice slicing cleanly through his denial. "Digital forensics is an exact science. You thought you were dealing with a naive housewife you could easily discard. You never bothered to understand what I actually did for a living. You never knew my online moniker was Apex. I spent the last 10 years building cybersecurity networks for international financial institutions. Breaching your pathetic phone encryption took me less than 4 minutes. I did not just recover your deleted text messages. I recovered the synchronized cloud backups you foolishly forgot to wipe. And more importantly, I recovered the synced audio logs from the hidden dashcam installed inside your luxury sports car. Derek's eyes widened in terror. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified animal. He knew exactly what audio she meant. He reached out his hand, shaking violently, as if he could physically stop the digital files from executing. Isabella slowly tapped the spacebar. The boardroom speakers cracked to life. High-fidelity audio filled the tense silence, playing a clear recording of Derek and Veronica sitting inside his idling car. The sound of heavy rain pounding against the windshield echoed through the room, perfectly matching the timeline of the text messages. "Is she actually gone?" Veronica's recorded voice sneered, dripping with malicious amusement and venom. "I threw her bags onto the wet driveway and locked the deadbolt," Derek's recorded voice replied, accompanied by the distinct sound of him chuckling. "She is standing in the freezing rain crying right now. She has no money, no phone, and nowhere to go. I canceled her credit cards 5 minutes ago. The pathetic loser is completely stranded." "Good," Veronica's recorded voice responded coldly. "Make sure you completely drain the joint accounts before she finds a cheap lawyer. I want that initial $2 million pension transfer routed through the Cayman Shell Company by midnight. We are not leaving any loose ends for that street rat to find. She deserves to freeze out there for thinking she could ever belong in our world." The audio recording clicked off, leaving a devastating silence in its wake. The undeniable malice, calculated premeditation, and sheer cruelty of their own voices completely annihilated any lingering doubt. The victim narrative Veronica had attempted to construct was entirely incinerated. Richard buried his face in his trembling hands, groaning in pure agony. The audio proved his daughter was not a manipulated pawn, but the chief architect of the financial destruction and personal cruelty. He realized his legacy was not just tainted, it was thoroughly poisoned by his own flesh and blood. Veronica stopped struggling against the agents. The mask completely fell away. The fake tears vanished instantly, replaced by a contorted expression of absolute venomous rage. She glared at Isabella, her eyes burning with a toxic hatred. "You wretched, miserable orphan!" Veronica screamed, spitting obscenities across the long mahogany table. "You think you have won. You think a few deleted files and audio clips change who you actually are. You will always be a pathetic charity case. You do not belong in this boardroom. You do not belong in my world. I will bury you with my legal team. I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life scrubbing floors in a federal penitentiary." Isabella remained perfectly composed, letting the toxic venom wash over her without leaving a single mark. She closed her silver laptop with a soft, definitive click. She looked directly into Veronica's deeply furious eyes. "Your legal team cannot save you from federal wire fraud, international embezzlement, and corporate espionage." Isabella said, her voice dropping to a terrifying absolute calm. "You do not have a world anymore, Veronica. You do not have a fortune. You do not have a private jet. And as of this exact moment, you do not even have your freedom. Your entire empire is gone." Suddenly, a piercing sound cut through the boardroom tension. Sirens wailed loudly from the busy city street far below, multiplying and growing closer by the second. Vivid red and blue lights began to violently flash their bright reflections, cutting through the darkness of the evening and illuminating the shattered glass covering the boardroom floor. The sweeping lights illuminated their horrified faces as the stark reality set in. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived to secure the building. The heavy steel-toed combat boots of the Federal Tactical Team trampled over the shattered glass of the boardroom entrance. A dozen agents wearing windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI flooded the executive sanctuary. They moved with precision, fanning out across the room to secure every possible exit and establish perimeter control. The flashing of red and blue lights from the street below painted their stern faces in neon color. Jamal raised a hand, signaling the lead agent and pointing directly toward the far end of the mahogany table. The takeover of the stronghold was officially underway, executing with finality. Richard slumped sideways in his chair. The pang in his chest had blossomed into a crushing, suffocating agony. His face turned a shade of gray, his lips taking on a bluish tint. He clawed frantically at the collar of his shirt, gasping for air that his lungs simply refused to accept. His eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, filled with the terror of a man realizing his mortality and his total ruin simultaneously. He tried to issue one last order to his security team, but all that escaped his mouth was a wheeze. "We need medics in here right now," Jamal barked into his shoulder radio, his voice cutting through the escalating panic in the room. Within seconds, a team of paramedics rushed through the ruined doorway, pushing a gurney ahead of them. They swarmed Richard, tearing open his shirt to attach defibrillator pads to his pale, clammy chest. The billionaire was stripped of his aura. He was reduced to a man powerless as they strapped him to the stretcher. The paramedics wheeled him out of the boardroom in a rush, his legacy crumbling to dust in his wake. Veronica watched her father being wheeled away, her mind unable to process the devastation of her life. Before she could even register the loss, two female federal agents stepped up behind her. They grabbed her arms with a firm grip, yanking her to her feet. Veronica let out a piercing shriek. She thrashed and kicked her heels, scraping uselessly against the floor. "Take your filthy hands off me!" Veronica screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Do you have any idea who I am? My family owns half of this city. I will have your badges for this." The agents ignored her protests. With emotion, they wrenched her arms behind her back. The click of handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed over her screaming. The reality of the metal biting into her skin finally broke her delusion. Veronica collapsed into sobbing. Tears of mascara streamed down her face, staining her blouse. She looked pathetic, an heiress finally facing the consequences of her greed. The agents dragged her toward the exit, her wailing echoing down the corridor until she disappeared from sight. Derek watched the spectacle unfold, his breath coming in gasps. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him. The $50 million was seized. His father-in-law was incapacitated and facing indictment. His mistress was currently being dragged to a holding cell. He was alone, and there was nowhere left for him to run. The federal agents surrounding the table turned their stares onto him. Desperation obliterated whatever dignity Derek possessed. He fell to his knees. He scrambled forward, crawling across the carpet until he reached the spot where Isabella stood. He looked up at her, his face contorted in a mask of terror. He reached out his fingers, grasping at the hem of her skirt. "Isabella, please." Derek begged, his voice cracking into a whine. He looked up into her eyes, trying to weaponize their shared history to save his own skin. "You have to stop them. Please tell them to let me go. I gave you a home when you had absolutely nothing. I took you in. Think of our son. A growing boy needs his father in his life. You cannot let them take me away to prison. I will do anything you want. Just please show some mercy." Isabella did not move away. She stood perfectly still, looking down at the groveling, broken man at her feet. Her eyes were completely devoid of mercy, reflecting only the hardened steel of a woman who had survived the absolute worst he could inflict. She leaned in close, her presence radiating a lethal, undeniable power. Her voice remained remarkably steady, but it carried a deadly, freezing weight that silenced his pathetic sobbing. "Do you remember what you told me in the freezing rain, Derek?" Isabella asked, her words slicing through the air like a sharpened scalpel. "You looked me right in the eyes and you said, 'I do not need a child holding back my career.' You gave up your absolute right to be a father the exact second you threw us out into that violent storm." Isabella reached down with sudden lightning-fast precision. Her hand shot forward and grabbed the expensive silk designer tie looped securely around his neck. It was the exact same silver and blue tie she had bought for his birthday 3 years ago, back when she still believed he was a decent man. She twisted the fabric tightly in her fist and yanked downward with incredible, furious strength. The expensive silk ripped cleanly away from his collar, leaving a frayed, ruined knot behind. She tossed the torn fabric onto the floor right next to his trembling hands. "Take him away," Isabella ordered the agents, her voice echoing with total, absolute finality. 2 towering federal agents stepped forward immediately. They hoisted Derek off the floor by his armpits, dragging him backward toward the shattered doorway. Derek kicked and thrashed wildly, his legs dragging across the marble. He screamed her name over and over again in a pathetic display of pure, unadulterated agony, his cowardly cries fading slowly into the cold, quiet night as the heavy steel elevator doors finally slammed shut, firmly sealing his complete and utter destruction forever. The boardroom, once an impenetrable fortress of executive hubris, had been transformed into a cold, clinical staging ground for justice. The red and blue lights pulsing against the floor-to-ceiling glass created a haunting rhythmic strobe, reflecting off the shattered remains of the doors. 3 months had passed since the night of the raid, yet the air in the city courthouse still crackled with the residual tension of the fall of the Thorn Vanguard Empire. Derek and Veronica sat in the center of the courtroom, their designer attire replaced by sterile gray prison-issued jumpsuits. The judge's sentence of 15 years in federal prison for massive embezzlement, international wire fraud, and the systematic dismantling of client portfolios was delivered with a finality that silenced the gallery. Veronica, her hair matted and eyes devoid of their former sharp, calculating vanity, began to sob violently, burying her face in her cuffed hands. Eric, once the golden boy of the Manhattan social scene, stared straight ahead at the hardwood floor, his face a hollow mask of irredeemable loss. Their collaborator Caroline had fared little better. Her attempts to use her socialite network to secure bail had been thwarted by the overwhelming weight of the digital evidence Isabella had provided. She was sentenced to 5 years for her direct role in the forgery and the destruction of physical records. As the bailiffs led her away, she scanned the back of the courtroom for any sign of her former elite friends, but the gallery was empty. She had been entirely alienated from the world she had spent a lifetime desperately trying to cultivate. She was alone, left to navigate the brutal reality of prison with the same arrogance that had initially guaranteed her ruin. Back in the boardroom, the atmosphere was vastly different. Isabella stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her silhouette framed by the expansive view of the city skyline. She did not look like the woman who had been cast out into the rain. She looked like a force of nature. She held a heavy, solid gold fountain pen in her hand, the very symbol of the executive power that had been wielded against her for years. Jamal stood a few paces behind her, his posture straight, his eyes burning with a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude. He had endured years of patronizing classist and openly bigoted abuse from Derek's family, often forced to stand in the corner of this very room and endure insults while he worked to save their failing accounts. Isabella turned, her gaze softening as she looked at him. She extended her hand, offering him the gold pen. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. "You stood by me when everyone else saw a liability," Isabella said, her voice steady and warm. "You saw the truth of this company, and you worked harder than anyone to keep it from collapsing under their greed. You earned this, Jamal." Jamal hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to take the pen. Diana, his wife, stood near the doorway, watching with tears of pride shining in her eyes. She had seen the sleepless nights Jamal had spent protecting the firm's integrity, the times he had come home feeling utterly defeated by the casual cruelty of his superiors. As Jamal closed his fingers around the cool metal of the pen, he looked at Isabella. He did not need to speak. The shared understanding of their journey was absolute. He sat in the CEO's chair, the massive leather backrest supporting him, and for the first time in his career, he belonged. He smiled a genuine, radiant smile at Diana, who blew him a soft kiss. The boardroom was no longer a place of oppression. It had been reclaimed. The transition of power was swift and surgical. Within the week, the entire executive floor had been overhauled, the toxic culture eradicated along with the perpetrators of the fraud. Isabella moved through the halls like a ghost, her mission completed. She didn't want the title. She wanted the result. She wanted to see the people who had tried to build their success on the bones of others finally forced to watch someone from the wrong neighborhood succeed where they had failed. As evening approached, Isabella left the soaring Manhattan skyscraper. The air outside was crisp, the clouds finally breaking apart to reveal the fading purple hues of the twilight. The city hummed with life, completely unaware of the tectonic shift that had occurred behind the glass walls of the Thorn building. Elias was waiting for her by the idling black town car. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression patient and respectful. As Isabella neared the vehicle, Elias stepped forward. He reached into the car, pulling out a heavy cashmere coat to protect her from the sudden drop in evening temperature. He draped the coat over her shoulders with meticulous care. He smiled warmly, acknowledging the quiet strength that had carried them through the storm. Isabella looked up at the skyscraper, its lights reflecting in her dark eyes. She thought about the night Derek had tossed her belongings into the mud, the night he had told her she was nothing, the night he thought he had destroyed her. Some people think that being a submissive, silent wife is the ultimate destination for a woman. Isabella murmured, her voice barely audible over the distant roar of city traffic. She pulled the cashmere coat tighter around herself, feeling the warmth. But I learned something out there in the freezing rain. She watched the clouds finally vanish, the stars beginning to puncture the dark velvet of the night. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman who had seen the absolute limit of her own endurance and had decided that the limit was infinite. When someone throws you out into the storm, she concluded, her voice steady and lethal, it isn't the end. It's the exact moment you realize you're the one who controls the lightning. With that final declaration, she climbed into the car. The door clicked shut, silencing the noise of the city. Elias took his place in the driver's seat and the engine purred to life. She didn't look back at the building one more time. She was already looking at the horizon, at the infinite opportunities of a life truly hers, free from the constraints of others' expectations or the shadows of her past. She had survived the storm, and now she was the one who would decide where it struck next. The car pulled away, merging seamlessly into the flow of the city, leaving the ruin of the boardroom to fade into history. Isabella Thorne had arrived, and the world would never be the same again.